Well, thank you for the opportunity to share some history. And as I'm going to suggest at the end, I think it has some relevance to the current times and the future. So the title of my presentation is The Rise, Fall and Recovery of Drilling in the 90s. And basically the theme through this presentation is on outcome-based contracting in drilling operations. So in the beginning, there's what I call the pull. So I'm looking at this from two sides. And the intention of the operator was to shift from doing the operations to supervising the operations, which meant giving greater responsibility to the suppliers for their results. And the operator integrated together their drilling supervision with their drilling engineering. So the university guys overlapped with the guys who had the hands-on experience and the round one, round two education. There was a request or requirement for greater responsibility from the drilling contractors, and the drilling contractors were then placed in the role of lead contractor. The operations or the contracts focused on outcomes. So instead of cementing, we were actually asking for zonal isolation. Instead of directional drilling, we were asking for intercepting the subsurface targets. And then the skip payment schemes are mostly arranged around either incentive schemes, which had been around before, and turnkey payment schemes. And in 1990, I presented a paper at the IADC Drilling Conference in Houston called Drilling Contracting in the 90s. And at a keynote luncheon speech, Rick Charlton presented the whole of this idea of drilling in the 90s in its fullest extent. And then there was a reaction. The IADC Drilling Contracts Committee used to publish a monthly newsletter, and their next newsletter came out with a lead article that was called Playing the Shell Game. And as everybody knows, that's really referring to a confidence trick used to perpetuate fraud. And then we were invited to come to Houston and basically asked to come and explain ourselves. And I remember I went to Houston with my boss, and we ended up in a room where there was a U-shaped layout with all the people from the IADC Drilling Contracts Committee. And then the head of the committee was at the head of the U. And then we were sat at a table at the open end of the U. And then we were asked to explain ourselves, which we did. So I actually took the lead article, I identified all the key items that had been brought up in it, which there were a lot, and then addressed them with presentation on good old acetates, the good old overhead. Then what we found out really was that drilling contractors were mostly against taking on additional responsibility. That was their big issue. And then some international drilling contractors actually decided they wanted to follow this route. So they prepared themselves. And I would say that they did succeed in taking on the lead contractor role. And then the whole process waxed before it waned. It grew and then it waned afterwards, as most people probably recognize. Drilling contractors were involved in turnkey contracts, alliance contracts, and incentive contracts. And there were successes enough to prove the concept, but not always. I think that it's fair to say there were some downsides. So one was a turnkey project in Lekware in Oman, where the drilling contractor actually constructed 2 purpose-built rigs for this multi-well contract. The operator had been drilling at 16 days. The turnkey contractor bid at 13 days equivalent. After a couple of hiccups on the first wells, they got quickly to 11 days, and then they ended up coming down the learning curve to 8 days. So they were delivering 8-day wells when they priced them on 13, and the history was 16. And then there was, in the Dutch North Sea, there was a success with 2 alliances. Each of them was built around a different drilling contractor. And then Nimir in Oman was a huge success. It was a footage-based contract, and the drilling contractor, again, built a rig for the purpose and drilled very fast wells. But the big downside to this one was they out-drilled the supply of wells and the rig got stacked. So that's one of the big negative downsides. Are you going to outstrip yourself? And then in Tanzania, there was a rig there where it was owned by one company that also owned the cementing company. So it was a big integrated contractor. And they actually had a shutdown for about a day and a half, if I remember correctly. And the shutdown was due to a cement unit filter being blocked. So here came the issue about the additional risk due to other services being under the drilling contractor. And then the Ile de Seine contract was a tender-assisted barge in the South China Sea that actually had a 30-well contract, 10 wells on one platform and 20 on the other. And they fixed an agreement with the operator to share 50% of the savings of the total day rate. So the rig was actually on a day rate of $17,000 a day, the contract rate, and the savings were measured off $40,000 a day, 50-50 split. So the drilling contractor earned $20,000 a day for each day saved. The first wells were drilled, or the operator had been drilling wells at 13 days, and then the contractor immediately drilled the wells in 7 days. So there was a big bonus. And the bonus was shared with the big company who shifted from roller cones to PDC bids, the mud company, which changed the mud, the directional drilling company, which focused on the ability to drill fast wells, and all the crews involved in the process. So successes, but then those downsides as well. And then the service company stepped up with integrated services. And we saw a lot of what we call bundling back then, was adding on services to core services to get more work. But some were offering actually true performance. And one of the interesting ones came about in the Austin Chalk, where integrated downhole services, so bits, motors, the directional drilling process, were integrated with the muds and were run on incentives. And that was very successful. And then there were some large contracts let in the North Sea under the integrated service umbrella. Then the clash came with the drilling contractors because the service companies came around and they actually told everybody that what they were doing was saving the day rate costs of the rig. So they were offering their services for bonuses, but saying we're saving you money because you have less day rate for the rig. So that didn't go down too well with the drilling contractors. And then comes the rub, as I call it. It waned. And one of the big things I don't think people recognized was there was big internal resistance to this change, as well as this drilling contractor pushback. And there was a post-mortem done. I talked to the manager who actually did this, and he said the internal resistance within the operator was too great. So some drilling supervisors wanted the status quo, and what happened was they persuaded others. And then I was working as a consultant on a project to the operator, and I came across this younger generation person, an engineer, and he was absolutely against drilling in the 90s. And I couldn't understand why. I thought all the young people were in favor of it because they saw a better future for themselves with the mix of engineers with operations. But in fact, he'd been trained by some of the older boys who persuaded him it was the wrong thing. And then the drilling contractor pushback continued. They wanted day rates and they wanted to limit the liability. And of course, that is an issue, as I showed in those examples. And then a European major created a similar type of contract strategy, which they actually executed under the heading of alliances. And there were two key ones that were very successful: the Andrew Alliance, which I actually consulted to them on, and then the ETAP Alliance. And these were both in the North Sea. They were both big success. But they waxed and then they waned. So these alliances, which were successes at the time in the 90s, then disappeared and came back later. Then came the push. So what we saw was integrated project management being offered by the service companies. And I did an estimation a few years back and came out with basically estimating that more than 10% of the global rig count is actually being undertaken under IPM contracts. And as such, you can say that, well, it has market penetration. And then we saw in the Middle East, these lump sum turnkey contracts becoming common. So now we had the integrated project management companies offering their integrated project management rigs and services. And then we had the operators wanting to have lump sum turnkey contracts. And this is essentially an outcome-based style of contracting. Then what's happened more recently is the US land drilling contractors have been adding in services that have enabled them to deliver better wells. So they're adding in the directional drilling, the borehole surveying, the downhole simulations for the drill string dynamics. And in delivering better wells, they've started to ask for payments for those better wells. So they're starting to ask for what I would call outcome-based contracts to reward them for the improved wells. Then there's a Norwegian alliance that started in 2017, and it ran for 5 years, which was its period, and it's just been extended for 5 more years. And this is an interesting one because this is a resurrection, basically, of the alliances which I mentioned before that were around in the 1990s. And I asked the CEO of one of the drilling contractor companies involved in this alliance at a drilling conference in The Hague on a panel session. I said, is this an idea whose time has come, or is this 8 o'clock Groundhog Day? And she was very emphatic to say that she sincerely believed it was an idea whose time has come. And I think the fact that this alliance has been extended for 5 more years is proof of that. And all the parties involved in this, they've been talking about the positive benefits. So what is it? It's essentially frame agreements with the service company, multiple services, and the drilling contractors. And then there is a governance agreement over the top of this with a governance board, because basically when you look at it, it's very hard to articulate everything in an agreement, and you need some steerage of the relationship. They have agreed outcomes, and these outcomes are based on better wells, better development of the reserves. So they're outcomes that are of value to the operator, but also align the suppliers to the operator's goals. They're sharing cost savings and overruns, but the overruns are capped. That's very typical in these alliances. Share the savings, share the overruns, but cap the overruns. And one of the things they're really pushing here is driving digitalization and automation. So they're driving the implementation of it throughout the alliance. And because these different companies in the organization are working together, they're actually able to implement digitalization more easily. And they've come up recently saying basically they have taken well planning time from 3 months per well to under 2 weeks. And their figurative objective is plan a well in a day. So they're seeing huge gains in the effectiveness of their organizations by working together and implementing digitalization. And their focus is really on faster delivery and lower cost, equaling more activity. And I think some people might look and say, well, we've heard that before. You drill faster, you get lower cost, promises of more activity, but my rig got stacked, so I don't really believe it. But here, in fact, they've extended the rig contract and they've taken on another rig from the same drilling contractor. So there is more activity actually occurring in this alliance. And then if we look at digitalization and automation, this is a diagram which we published in SPE 208776, which Matt was one of the co-authors on this. And this is Scott Boone and Maury Lang came up with this diagram to look and see how is the well construction process changing. And originally C1 is termed compete. So this is where there were separate products that were competing with each other. And then C2 is complement, so complementary, remote directional drilling services, geosteering. So now we're having interconnected services in order to achieve the objectives. And then we get to collaborate. And this is where we start to see what's happening now with new solutions. So we're seeing automation agents coming in and actually applying to the drilling process and integrating with multiple suppliers. We're seeing some open source models coming out. Connected well plan, that's happening under the Wells Data Foundation, which is under OSDU. And they're coming up with a way to link the data from the drilling program into the activity schedule to automate the drilling. And to do this, it all falls under collaboration. So if we look at this, what I call a long journey, and I say that it continues, if I look back and take the scale on the left, the Y scale, going from day rate through incentive to outcome, and starting back, I picked 1985. We see that drilling in the 90s and the alliance from the European major that I mentioned took off in the 1990s and became well, established themselves then, but then they waned. And what I call this period was a period of pull, where the operators were pulling on the suppliers to come with these new kind of contracts based more around outcome-based contracting. And then what we saw, as I mentioned, was the IPM contracts with lump sum turnkey coming back in the 2000s. And then I suggest that with this alliance that's being very successful, that this is now continuing. And we can see two trajectories, one trajectory with day rates and one trajectory with this outcome-based contracting. And this is what I call push and pull. And because the service companies or suppliers are interested in doing this, I see that this is a change from just the pull basis back in the 1990s. So what are the lessons learned? I think industry right now is the contracting is outdated for the challenges it faces. So as we see these automation and digitalization, and as we see the focus more towards outcomes, I think we're going to see a change in the way things are contracted. Digitalization and automation actually are driving this change to collaborate, and it's regardless of the contracts. I think that's interesting, that the collaboration is occurring through the digitalization and automation. So maybe the contract should follow. One thing that I saw as a lesson learned is management of change. It needs to be what I call spot on and have leadership support. And the alliance I talked about in the North Sea that's ongoing today, the CEOs of the various companies involved actually stand up and speak positively about their involvement in that alliance. So the leadership support is going to the very top of those companies, which I think is very important. Don't underestimate resistance to change. And there's two types of resistance. There's the visible and invisible. And if you look at lean manufacturing lean management coming from lean manufacturing, you can actually see that one of the things they look to address in their transition is the invisible resistance. And they actually have a term, they call these people concrete heads. So they say you've got to find out where they are and you've got to take them out of the transition process, otherwise they're going to inhibit the change. And then WIFM, what's in it for me, for all the parties? And I think what we're seeing now is push and pull. So both sides want to get some more out of the outcomes versus just the pull, which was what was occurring in the 90s. So I think that this is a big change. And then I believe outcome contracts will grow. And I think the big issue is learn how to implement them. They're not as easy as day rate contracts. If you look at day rate contracts, it's easy to specify equipment, personnel, scope of work, and then to put a day rate onto it or a time and materials kind of payment scheme. When you get to outcome-based contracts, they take a lot more work to implement and to manage. And I think that's something that we need to learn to do, because for sure they are coming. And with that, I'd like to thank you and take the opportunity for questions.
Any questions?
I have a comment, more than a question, but it's in line with what you said. Hi, John. Tracy Cummins with Weatherford here. That was a very interesting talk. Really appreciate that. I'm kind of going through that now, where a major oil company in Guyana, is doing like an informal alliance where there's not really, anyone in contract, but all the elements of the alliance are there. And, but I think that it needs to be more formalized as what you talked about, I guess, in Europe, because of the reasons, the resistance to change, the sharing of information, all of that. So I think you're right in saying that, it's probably has a life now and it's expanding beyond Europe. But I just wanted to add that comment that I feel like it needs to be formalized to speed up the process and get everyone actually working together. It's really important about, trade secrets, commercial information, all that. Everyone is so afraid to share that information. And even like what makes it successful, which is the data that's being, generated on the project and how you measure KPIs and things like that. So that's what I want to say.
Yeah, thank you.
John, this is Kyle Fontaine with retired Conoco Billings and BP. Are the contracts that were done in the North Sea, or in Europe, were they, when you say, look at the outcome, what is measured into the outcome? Because though I'm a driller's driller, you know, the operators, really the outcome is the production. And you can drill a really fast well, and you can save money on drilling, and all the drillers look like heroes. But then the completions and the production engineers have to live with a really crap well from their standpoint for the next 10, 15, 20 years. So are they tying the reservoir and the production of these wells into the overall outcome, or is it just stopped with days of drilling?
No. So it's not just days of drilling, and you're absolutely right. The outcomes need to be a quality product which can be used by the production or the completions and then the production department. So one of the things I recall from the Alliance in the North Sea in the 90s was the zonal isolation above the reservoir. That was one criteria. Another criteria was the percentage of perforations contributing to flow on the average of 3 wells. So they were actually picking items to measure success, which were based upon the quality of the well in terms of its production capability going forwards. And the generator of the money for the bonus scheme or bonus penalty scheme was actually the well cost. So it's a matter of agreeing a well cost. And then if you get smart about saving money on drilling the well, so normally drilling it quicker, then that goes into the pot to reward everybody, but the rewards are based on the outcomes.
Hi, John, Rob McMillan. That was great, thank you. I think Carl just asked my question really, because you talked about drilling contractors in the US getting paid for better wells, but I didn't see a definition of better, but maybe that's what you just addressed with regard to production and maybe preparation.
Well, actually, Robin, that's a great question. I think, and I think we've discussed this a bit, the definition of what is a better well needs to be articulated. And today people are talking more about tortuosity. So effective diameters in the wellbore section through the reservoir, or just above the reservoir as well, particularly for placing ESP. So to get the life out of the ESP, because the tortuosity is low enough that it's not causing bending stresses on the ESP. And I think as well, people are now beginning to look at porpoising of wells. So wells that go up and down in the reservoir section in the horizontal, and that they actually have liquid dropout in those sections, and that impairs production. So I think it's something that's still being developed, and people need to articulate what is a better well in terms of its full life cycle, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, in order that the drillers can then know and get measured on delivering a better well quicker and not just a quicker well.
Thanks, John.
This is Paul Best at the ExxonMobil. I have a comment and a question for your opinion. The comment is that I 100% agree on collaboration. I think we've got a couple of good contractors that we're using very effectively with their own performance contracts, and their premium rates, incorporating a lot of automation as well. And I think we're happy with it. I believe they're happy with it too. I'll let them speak to themselves with that. But you know, we think that's worked real well. The interesting thing shows up though is that let's say we want to run in ROP mode because we think that's a better way to do something. But the contractor has, you know, the incentive is to drill more footage per day, and they go, oh, if you slow me down, then I'm gonna lose some of my incentive. And so in the past, operators, we would just say, just drill it the way we tell you to. Don't ask any questions, just drill it. And now we're having that conversation of why do we want to do what we do? We're going to save a trip, we're going to do something else. So that collaboration has increased our requirements, or that the way we written contracts increase our requirements for collaboration. So that was my comment. The other one is we also, instead of having a contract with one rig and another contract, having 50 contracts and 30 rigs under drilling at any given time, we concentrated out in just a few so that we can spread lessons learned much faster. So I want your comment on that in terms of, yes, the cost per contract might be higher in terms of maintenance, but you can do that with fewer contracts if you structure that.
Yeah, I didn't quite catch your question there, Paul. Can you state it again?
Yeah, my question to you was, is that an important part of the, being able to concentrate into just a few contractors and so you can share lessons learned? Is that a big part of the advantage?
Well, I think if you look at the US land and then you look overseas, you're looking at longer term contracts overseas. And I think that the contracts need to have a good period to them in order to be able to put these outcome-based contracting into process. But if the industry transitions more and more to that, then I think it's something you might be able to pick up on a short-term contract because the industry would be used to doing it. Right now, the industry is used to doing day rate contracts. And so that's the easiest mode to go and operate in if you're looking at a rig just drilling a couple of wells.
It's gonna be one more short question.
Hi, Aaron Dean, Barrel Energy Solutions. Hi, John. It sounds like a lot of what you're advocating for is, if I can simplify, a lot more top-down, centralized planning and long-term contracts. Given that mindset, how do you also benefit from take advantage of a lot of the benefits of some of the free market dynamics of competition and getting other people involved and innovation that comes from that?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question because, yeah, if the markets change, you might get a cheaper rig. But I think the history has shown that just getting a rig a better day rate of a rig because of the market conditions is not necessarily giving you better wells or lower cost wells. I mean, some of the examples I showed you was drilling wells in 7 days and then drilling them in 13 days and then drilling them in 7, drilling them in 16 and then drilling them in 8. So there were big savings, big reductions in time to drill those wells. And I think that is overarching over the benefits you may get from a lower day rate. Don't forget, when day rates get very low because of market conditions, the drilling contractors and suppliers are suffering. So you're actually stressing the organizations that are trying to deliver you better wells. And I don't think that really works.
But I think probably.
Yes.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, John.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to present virtually.